Welcome to the fifth presentation in the series where we're looking at Paul's letter to the Romans. We're now looking at chapter 2, the first 16 verses, and I've entitled this Human Accountability. The letter to the Romans. Human accountability. Let's just reflect back on what we've uncovered in the previous presentations. We humans have a big dilemma. We want to run our own lives, do it our way, take our own decisions. I want it my way. We don't want God or gods to interfere and mess us up. We want to take the decisions. We want to be in control. And we think that freedom means we can do what we like. That's a fundamental human dilemma. And what Paul has painted in the last part of the previous chapter is the inevitable consequences of squeezing God out of our lives. Now he's describing the outcomes in the context of the Greek Roman culture and society of his day. And he's looking at what happens when we decide to go that way, run our own lives, do our own thing, and push God out of our life. The picture he gives is this: as we reject God because we're built to worship someone or something, we generate substitute gods. It could be we worship ourselves, our brains, our minds, humanism of a sort. Or we could be going for everything that's possessions and wealth and things that we can gain. Or we can go for some kind of religion and go through performance. Or we can just seek to be happy. That what is good, what we want, is what makes us feel good. So we may be self-centered, or we may be ruled by possessions, or it may be ruled by what basically is utterly irrational ritual and rule-keeping. Or it may end up in our pursuit of happiness, others suffer. What Paul points out is that if we go down that line as a society, and he's pictured a society, Roman society, that's the inevitable consequence. And if you look at the history of the world, that is true. The inevitable consequence of pushing God to the margins of life, squeezing him out, running our own things, doing it our own way, it generates social and relational breakdown, sooner or later. There were many questions raised in the previous presentations. We addressed some of these questions. I want us to pick up two of them here. Truth, because we're going to need this concept later on in this presentation. And I suggested that truth is that which fits the evidence. Not opinion, not make-believe, not depending on some authority figure, but that which fits the evidence. And Paul speaks of the evidence of the physical world. That doesn't prove God exists, but it points to a creator with extraordinary power, ability, capacity for order and design. And the evidence by looking at ourselves, because we all have a kind of God consciousness and awareness of the spiritual. There's also an awareness in every culture of right and wrong. And that points to, doesn't prove, but points to a creator who works by ethical principles. Paul points to that in the previous chapter. We also looked at this idea that God is so opposed to idolatry. Good reason for it. Because we reflect what we worship. The problem is, and it's always a truth, that beliefs lead to behavior. What we believe leads to what we do. That's what Prophet Muhammad believed. If someone wrongs you, retaliate, get the boot in first, hit them hard. They won't try it again. Jesus said that. When you're persecuted, don't retaliate. Directly opposite. Love. Consider your enemy's agenda first as your priority. Pray for those who are hurting you. Two exactly opposite perspectives. But you can look out in the world and you can see the consequences of these two belief systems. So Paul is emphasizing that idolatry is the source of unethical behavior. That is always true. Because we reflect what we worship. And much of the trouble in the Middle East today comes back from this retaliation concept. We reflect what we worship. That's why God is opposed to us worshipping false gods. That's why he wants to draw us to worship himself, to put Jesus central. because we reflect what we worship. Now let's move on into chapter 2 with that background behind us. Paul's analysis here. In the last chapter he's looked at human society. And probably most people agree with his analysis. We agree that things are badly wrong. But then we look aside and we say, well, it's not my problem, that's someone else's problem. If people want to live that way, that's up to them. I don't share that viewpoint, but it's no effect upon me. Not so, says Paul. He challenges that perspective. And what Paul now wants us to do is to listen to what he's saying. He brings it down to a personal level. And in the original text, he changes from the general description of Roman cultural society of that day and the problems that it faced. He moves from that general description of an awful picture that we probably wouldn't like either, and then he puts it all in the second person singular. You as an individual, he says. Now in this he's using a literary device in his writing. It's a way of writing and a way of communicating that was common in that day. And it's a kind of dialogue, debate with an imaginary listener, but it's personal, it's an individual. If you like, he's addressing an imaginary you, and he's demolishing your arguments. Now you're not there, but Paul is putting up the arguments that you're likely to put up, then he's demolishing them. But it's a literary device. We understand it this way. Let's look at the text itself with that background. You, that's you singular. You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. Now we know that God's judgment against those who do such things is based on truth. So when you, a mere human being, pass judgment on them and yet do the same things, do you think you'll escape God's judgment? Or do you show contempt for the riches of his kindness, forbearance and patience, and not realizing that God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance? If you like, Paul saying this means you. As an individual, an imaginary listener, as the letter is read out. But notice the way God judges is based on truth. Now we're going to pick up both of these a little bit further in a moment or two, but let's read on in the text overall. But because of your stubbornness and your unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath against yourself for the day of God's wrath, when his righteous judgment will be revealed. God will repay each person according to what they have done. To those who by persistence in doing good seek glory, honor, and immortality, he will give eternal life. But for those who are self-seeking and who reject the truth and follow evil, there'll be wrath and anger. There will be trouble and distress for every human being who does evil, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. But glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does good, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For God does not show favoritism. Now that's pretty straight. Remember, the you is you singular. Paul is addressing you as you watch this DVD, as an individual. Stubbornness, unrepentant heart. Wow. That rocks us back a bit. It challenges our thought. It speaks about God's anger. Speaks about God's judgment. We're always a bit uncomfortable with the concept of God being angry, but remember, God is angry because he cares. He's angry when anything messes up his creation, and God's there to put things right, and he always does it fairly. We don't always see what's right, or we don't always see what's fair. But we can rely on God, because God is righteous. God acts with complete integrity. No favoritism. Moving on. All who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law, and all who sin under the law be judged by the law. For it's not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but as those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. This will take place on the day when God judges people's secrets through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares. That's quite hard going. The word that Paul uses for sin there is a word that's used of missing the mark, or missing the mark in life, if you like. The archer with the arrow doesn't miss the bullseye, he misses the whole target. How often we do that in life. We miss out on the best. But let's remember Paul is blunt here, and this is consistent with everything that's taught throughout the Bible, and specifically the teaching of Jesus. We are not judged on the basis of our correct theology. We are judged by our actions, how we treat others. Because how we treat others indicates what's really in our hearts and how we really are. Judgment is not based on holding the correct ideas and signing on. Let's just stop and ponder. How do we, as individuals, treat each other? But the trouble is, we all start from different baselines, and Paul's acutely aware of this. But God's favor is always honest and true. There is no favoritism. Now, though we start from different baselines, God knows that. And God judges on the basis of what we've been given. Now, with that backcloth of the text, let's look in more detail at the first 6 verses. Up on screen again. I want to focus on that word judgment just for a moment. Now, I've picked out words which all carry the idea of judgment in some form or another. Now, in fact, in the original language, there's some connections between these words, but it's not the same word. Paul, a master of the Greek language, an intellectual giant, has used his words very, very carefully. So there's several related words here, but once we understand that and see what these words actually mean, it all starts to make sense. So I've divided it up now, and the words in the pinky purple colour there, that's speaking about us. You see, we tend to look at other people and point the finger and condemn. Let's be honest, that's what we do. And Paul's given us a picture of all the bad things in the Roman culture and society of his day. And now he's saying, well, there's no point in us pointing the finger and condemning these people and thinking that we're better. That's a human failing. We do it all the time, sadly. But if we're honest in so doing it, we're actually condemning ourselves because we're no better. It's so often the case that we criticize and condemn others for things that we do exactly the same. We may use different words in different ways, but it's the same basic thing. We're no better. We're all in the same boat together. Now, when it comes to God's judgment, the word there has got an emphasis on the verdict, not on condemnation. You see, God is objective. God does not have favourites. God looks at our situation. He sees the problem. He pronounces the verdict on what we are and what we're doing, and he wants to put it right. That's a very different perspective compared to the way we humans judge and condemn each other. And you can see it in that pair of words there, which in the original is one word, which is a compound word. It's got the two words giving us righteous and judgment bolted together. And to try and capture the idea, I describe that as bringing actions out into the open so that just consequences can follow. Actions have consequences. Paul stresses that. And God's purpose is to bring out into the open what we are and what we've done so that things can be put right. That's a very positive notion. So just simply looking at the language Paul uses, it gives us a new insight into what we mean by judgment and how different God's judgment is from our human judgment, which is always aiming at pointing the finger at other people and therefore bolstering ourselves. We're all in the same boat. But God is objective. He looks at the verdict. And he wants to bring things out into the open so that things can be sorted out. Paul has pictured mankind. So often we worship the creation. We only have to stop for a moment or two and look at Western Europe and see that that pattern is all over the place. We're living in a world of humanism. We're worshipping ourselves and our ability to solve our problems. We worship our minds, created by God. Or we're desperate for more and more possessions and wealth and money. And everything is decided. Every budget decision is weighed by how we benefit. And we're living in a world of getting more at the expense of others often. So it goes on. That's the alternative. Now if you stop and ponder, these are the only two alternatives. We are built to worship. And we'll worship something or someone if we do not worship God. By worship I mean putting them central in our life as the priority. Paul has pointed out that's the inevitable consequence, and history shows that Paul had it right. The real problem is this. Let's look at our lives. If we are putting God central in our lives, does it show? Does it make any difference? Sadly, studies across the churches have shown that the ethical and moral behavior of the people who are attached to churches is often no better than wider society. That should not be so. Are we really putting God central? Does it show? Does it make a difference? Paul is challenging us here. We have no right to point the finger at other people when our actions are just as bad. And there's been a history of dreadful stories emerging from the organized church in past decades. And they're still coming out, sadly. We should be hanging our heads in shame. We are no better. Now what God wants to do is this, and it's positive. Not negative, not destructive, not vindictive. God's not an angry deity just waiting to jump upon us and delight in our torture. God wants to bring our actions into the open, to be honest, so that things can be put right. The consequences will have to be faced, perhaps, but things can be put right. That's the goal. That's the aim. That's the picture that Paul is painting for us here. And it is absolutely beautiful. In our Christian communities, we have to sit down with each other and be honest about what we've been doing, how we've been behaving, how we've treated each other. There's so much that's wonderful and good in Christian communities, and it's being masked and undermined by this failure to bring things out into the open, sort things out, put things right. God's in the business of putting things right for the benefit of humanity. There's our judgments and there's God's judgments, and we've seen just by the use of language that they're not quite the same thing. We think we're very clever in our modern societies, and we base things on our standards. In the process, we're always having a go at someone else. The blame culture rules, seeking to bring others down, to point the finger, to condemn others. That's typical of humanity. God doesn't work that way. There is an objective truth about what is right and wrong. And God's objective through that is to bring it into the open, to bring our behavior into the open, in order to put things right, to make things better for us. God's agenda is always love. He is always seeking the best for us. But if we're not going to be honest with Him, then there are limits to what can happen. God bases it on truth, objective truth. Now that's an unfashionable notion in our postmodern society. There is something that is right and wrong, in exactly the same way as there are principles by which this universe in the physical realm operates. And you can't decide that it's not true and there is no gravity and then step off the top of a 4-story building. Your life will be finished. It is a truth. It is objective. It is a fact. The evidence shows it. And the evidence shows clearly that there is an objective basis of right and wrong. And God bases everything. He's trying to put things right on that basis. It's not our standards. God's truth is not theoretical. It's objective. And again I come back to that description, that which fits the evidence, the facts. Let's look at it again. And God's judgment is not a negative notion. Essentially, God really wants to put things right. Yes, in the end of the day, if we continue to thumb our noses at Him, that putting things right will have horrendous consequences. But His aim for here and now is to bring our actions out into the open, to sort things out, to put things right, to make life richer, fuller and better. That's God's aim. God is love. So what Paul, the point he's making is this, that we're all in the same boat together. There's no one-upmanship or superior group. There's those who ignore the evidence of the moral and ethical basis of the universe, and we thumb our nose at God and do our own thing. And there's those who do know something of the moral and ethical basis of the universe. And Paul is speaking about the Jewish law here. In the first picture, in the last chapter, he's speaking about the moral excesses of the Roman culture of his day. And the fact that the Jews saw themselves as superior because they had this law, this Torah. But at the end of the day, we're both living by the decisions that we run our own lives. We do our own thing. There is no group in society that is superior. Groups present themselves that way. It is not true. Having an idea of the moral basis that is God's doesn't make us any better. We've got to live within it. And if we don't live within it, if we live outside it, and the Christian community today are so often living on the same basis as the moral excesses of Western culture, it should not be so. Let's just summarize God's judgment. Always based on truth. And we pointed out before that Jesus said, I am the truth. That's some claim. But His resurrection, seen by hundreds, justifies the claim. It's based on what we do, basically how we treat other people, because how we treat others reflects what's really inside us. God is always totally fair. Religious pedigree, holding the right religion, God's religion, correct theology, outward appearances, performing rituals, they're totally irrelevant. They cut no ice before God. God looks inside us. And He knows what really is in each of us. And the best evidence of what's in us is how we treat each other. And God knows our life circumstances. He knows what's been given to us or what's not been given to us. He knows our upbringing, our circumstances. We can trust God to take all that into account. God's judgment is always for the benefit of humanity. In verse 6 it says that. It may be quoted from one of two passages, from Psalm 62 or Proverbs 24. You reward everyone according to what they have done, says the psalmist. Or will he not repay everyone according to what they have done? Proverbs. Because what we do, how we treat others, reflects the inner that is us. But we've got to watch that word repay. It's linked to the idea of cause and effect. That's the way the word was used. There are inevitable consequences as night follows day for our actions in this life as well as hereafter. And the word does not come to be used to evaluate human worth, human work on the basis of moral worth. There are not some acts that are better than others. It all comes back to how we treat each other. That is consistently taught throughout the Bible. What we do reflects who we are internally. How we treat the people round about us, the people whom we meet day to day, reflects the inner reality of how we are inside ourselves. So this is speaking about the inevitability of consequences. There is cause and effect, actions have consequences as night follows day. And it's always fair. And as someone has said, we are free to choose, but not free from the consequences of choice. That's a very deep thought, and how true to life it is. Choices that you and I have made in our past have consequences that we're living with today. Sometimes very wonderful and good. Sometimes we grit our teeth and wish we had never made that choice in the past. Now we come to this very difficult stretch about the law, the last little bit in here. We read it before. All who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law, and all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. And then it speaks about Gentiles, that's just the non-Jews. They didn't have this law. Now Paul is partly at least focusing on the Jewish law, what they called the Torah. Essentially the first 5 books of the Old Testament, but often was widened to the whole of the Old Testament. Now the non-Jews didn't have that book. But very often the non-Jews were following their consciences, the inner law of God within themselves, and were often fulfilling in their lives much of what the law was saying. Because the law, the Jewish law, is a summary of the characteristics of life that God wants for humanity. Not to impress him, not to win favour with him, but simply because when we live that way, we get life to the best. God made us, and God knows what's best for us. And it's a guide, a pattern of living. And then Paul speaks about judging people's secrets. See, God sees us inwardly. And the best judge of how we are inwardly is how we've treated each other. And that's the last little bit of this section. This word law, if you look at the Old Testament and look at the law and look at the teaching, that's what you'll find. It was never given as a rule book so that people would try and keep these rules, therefore to impress God and win a place in heaven. There is no concept of heaven or hell in the Jewish mind. Indeed, there is no word in the Hebrew language for hell as we understand it today. When it's translated hell, it's just a shadowy place of the dead. That's what the word means. No, God gave a guidance, a pattern for his people. You are my people, I've made you my people. Now this is the kind of lifestyle that will really bring you benefit. This is the kind of lifestyle that will give you a fulfilled life. The trouble was This is how it had ended up. In the days of Jesus, the law had been reduced and degraded to a set of rules. And the Pharisees were the best at this. They'd interpret these rules and they'd set up rules and regulations. You had to keep them. And if you didn't keep them, God would not be pleased and you'd be in trouble. That's never the way it was given. And if you look at the Old Testament, it's very clear it was never the way it was given. Now, Paul rejects it totally rightly, that degradation of the Old Testament. He rejects the idea of keeping rules to impress God as a way forward. He shows none of us are good enough. In fact, it is simply logical. If we think that any of us could keep enough rules to impress God and win his favour, that's laughable. God the Lord of glory and universe in perfection? Paul rejects that. But it's resurfaced today, particularly in Islam, where the Quran and the Hadith are given as rules, and Muslims have to follow these rules scrupulously and carefully. Indeed, they're very often imposed. And it's clearly taught in Islamic scholarship this is the way to impress God. It's the only way to have any chance of getting to paradise when you die. Logically, it's laughable. Paul dismisses it. But he also dismisses the idea and rejects it completely that simply knowing the rules gives you some kind of privilege before God. No, it doesn't, he says. It's the way you live. It's the way you treat other people. That's the evidence of your inner relationship with God. Because if we have a relationship with God, God who is the God of love, whose agenda always is the best for us, for others, then we will start to reflect that, and our agenda will always be the best for others. That is the evidence of the reality of spiritual life within us. But we'll develop that further in subsequent presentations. So there are two groups, those without the law and those under the law. The Jews had the law, the non-Jews didn't have it. And the point that Paul is making is, God makes up his mind in the light of our background. He's absolutely fair. That's an important principle. The problem of religion is that it relies on conscience. And it relies on imposed rule-keeping. You just think about every religion. They contradict each other all over the place because the rules aren't exactly the same. They're human man-made rules usually. We've all got a conscience, an instinct that points to right and wrong, and Paul is applauding that when people didn't have the Torah. But it's not completely reliable. But this is nothing to do with reality. This is a human invention. It's not what the Old Testament teaches. And Jesus demolished it. So does Paul. None of us can impress God and win his favour. No use trying to keep the rules to impress God. Now, Paul is not saying that it's no use trying to keep the rules. The rules are there for our benefit. Makes life work so much better. But not to impress God, because we can't, we're not good enough. And the trouble with religion is it generates pride. We are the in-group, we have it right, and what's more, the group down the road don't have it right. You see it most vividly today in the superiority complex of Islam. It is taught specifically in the Quran that Islam is God's religion and every other religion will not be accepted by God. We have it right, all of you are wrong. We are superior, we are of greater value, all of you are inferior. Now all religion does that to some extent. Paul is really having a go at that. He's going to develop this a lot further. The Torah, the Jewish rules, laws, principles of living, they are extremely helpful because they help our consciences, which are good but not totally reliable, to see what's right and wrong. but they're also extremely useful because they point out we're not good enough. When we look at the way life should be in God's plan and pattern, the Maker's Handbook if you like, and we realize we've missed the mark, we've missed the target completely. Help me. I need an instructor. I need someone to show me how to do it. It shows us we need help. And the New Testament shows us that. If we look at the life of Jesus, Jesus came to show humanity the answer. But he went one step further. He came to provide the answer. And Paul works that through in subsequent chapters of this letter to the Romans. With his cold, calm logic, he works this through. And he shows us the answer rests in what Jesus taught and in what Jesus did. But we'll leave that to subsequent presentations. In the next one, we're going to look at the concept of God's chosen people, often a description used of the Jewish nation, but sometimes applied more widely. How does Paul tackle that one?